Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are waiting for General Narasimhan to join us. I think, the rain may have, he was crossing India Gate a few minutes ago, so he should be here any minute. But I thought that we can start off. We are going to be looking at an ORF special report, which has been authored by, welcome. We are looking at an ORF special report, which has been authored by Abhijnan, and I think some of you, it's a slim report. At ORF, we believe in simplifying things. So I think Abhijnan has simplified matters, and in a nutshell, he has concluded that India is not well placed to fight a two-front war. I frankly don't know whether we still think of fighting a two-front war, or even a one-front war for that matter. But since the two-front war is something that has been talked about from time to time, although it is, as a concept, it goes back a couple of decades. But so what Abhijnan has done is he has not taken into account, let's say, qualities, say tanks. I mean, it's the quality of tanks may be different, capabilities of tanks may be different, but he's just gone by numbers, whether it is tanks or aircraft, put in a coefficient which could be 0.1, 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, in terms of Chinese capabilities, which could also end up joining. I don't know. I mean, I see a lot of people from the services here, of course, on this side as well as in the audience, but I don't know if any of them actually use these kind of coefficients to develop concepts of capabilities pertaining to two-front wars or not. But nonetheless, the conclusion is as stark as it gets, namely about the lack of preparedness, whether in terms of numbers or in terms of capabilities. So with that, I think I'm going to stop and open the floor. Who goes first? You go. Now, Abhijnan, and after yours? Okay. So we will start with Abhijnan, who will do a presentation on the paper. And then we will have comments on it by General Narasimhan, followed by Jayadeva. And we'll then open up the floor for larger interaction.
Good afternoon and welcome to ORF. I realize that a lot of you have braved rains to get here, so I'm very happy and very honored. It's a very sobering afternoon, and I think that matches with the discussion here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to quickly run you through the paper. The paper itself, as Ambassador Sood described, is a very short paper. It's very data-driven, graphics-driven paper. So I encourage all of you to either pick up a copy of the paper, which is outside, or it's also on ORF website. I'll first start with what this paper is, and then tell you what it isn't, and then summarize the results. It's going to be a very short presentation. First of all, this paper is a third paper in a multi-year ORF project on Indian defense policy that I lead. I started this last year. And what we want to address in this project is things like military doctrines, conventional nuclear force structures, interoperability with friendly foreign countries, limited wars under the nuclear overhang, military intelligence issues. So it's a very long project, very large project that we expect to roll well into 2019. The first paper in this series was a paper that I wrote with RUSI's Shashank Joshi on India's joint doctrine, which was released last year, followed by another paper on the political military aspects, interoperability aspects of the quadrilateral cooperation, naval cooperation, and this is the third one. So it's to get into the technical issues of what the paper seeks to do. This current one, I've sought to understand a two-front war involving China, Pakistan on one side, collusive or opportunistic threat that they may engage in together, versus India, using a single force metric. Now, military folks would know that force ratios are typically calculated in a simple way because they're two militaries. It's literally a bean count. You divide the opponent's force by your force, you get a number, that's the force ratio. Of course, in a two-front case, it's not that simple because this is, well, another guy in the picture. So what I did was I defined a ratio called, which I call a two-front force ratio, which is essentially the number of inventories on Pakistani side divided by the number of inventories on the Indian side. That's your classical force ratio between India and Pakistan. Plus, and this is the addition, some coefficient terms, a similar ratio involving China. This coefficient has a very specific physical meaning. And the meaning of this coefficient is that it's the fraction that China will deploy in a two-front war with India, because obviously China is not going to deploy all of its assets, because China has many, many threats floating around. So it will only give you a fraction of this asset. So if you look at that coefficient alpha, it's a number that runs between 0 and 1. So an alpha of 0.1 means that China will deploy 10% of its assets. An alpha of 0.2 means that China will deploy 20%. And so this is, in some sense, a two-front force ratio that you can cook up. What I did was then I tracked this using what I call the 11-10-9 methodology, because I took 11 conventional inventories, and we'll get into all the inventories when I show you the results, for India, China, and Pakistan spread over 10 years, which is between 2007 and 16, and this is visualized using 9 time series trends, 9 graphs, right? And the focus here was on long-term trends. See, I was not very interested in looking at what happened last year or the year before, but rather tracking this over time, over these 10 years, and seeing what the trends look like. And all the data that I used was from the IISS military balance volumes. They're pretty standard volumes for inventories. Having said that, I've assumed that the data is correct, and I've also assumed that the data is consistent across years. But that's a risk that one has to take, working with open source material. Let me tell you what it is not. And I think it's very important to discuss what this is not. First of all, this is not exhaustive. Okay, I've just used 11 conventional variables out of potentially hundreds. If you look at, if those of you who have looked at the military balance volumes, if you look at disaggregated inventories, they run into hundreds of parameters. It's not exhaustive. As Ambassador Sood pointed out, it also does not take into account quality or generations of fighters, generations of tanks, whether T-72 is better than T-90 is better than T-72, and issues of that sort. It is also not a net assessment, and it's very important to point out, when we release this paper on the web, a lot of people said, but you have not accounted for geography, but you have not accounted for doctrines, but you have not accounted for the role of external powers, right? All of which may play a role. But yes, you could do all of this if this was a net assessment. I didn't start out doing a net assessment of a two-front war. This is not a job of one person done over 2 months. I mean, it's entire teams that do net assessment. But having said that, we do hope that at the end of this multi-year project that we are doing, we will present a net assessment of a two-front conflict. This report is not a determinant of combat initiation or outcome. A lot of people say, does that mean that if India goes to war tomorrow in a two-front situation, India is guaranteed to lose? Well, maybe, maybe not, because a lot of factors have not been accounted for, such as terrain, nuclear overhang, yeah, all three are nuclear powers, external intercession will play a role. None of these have been accounted for. And finally, and this is a political point that I want to make, this is not an indictment of any particular government. Because in social media, when this paper was released, a lot of people said, does this mean that this current government is not doing something, or does it mean that the government before that was neglected? I think what has happened, and the trends show that there have been a considerable hollowing of defense resources in India over time, and successive governments have presided over this hollowness. So to say that the current guy is better or worse than the other guy, that can all be debated, right? Having said all of this, let me just quickly run you through the results. And I'm not going to get into many details, just show you the graphs. So that is the ratio, two-front force ratio for main battle tanks. If you see, it's a very interesting thing. Around 2013, the ratio went as high as 1.6. And I'll tell you how to interpret this number. It means to each Indian main battle tank. On the two-front side, there were 1.6 main battle tanks, but China having deployed only 20% of their battle tanks. Again, this is where terrain would have played into role. If I had incorporated geography, because 20% of Chinese tanks a lot of tanks, you can't deploy them in the Himalayan region. But these are illustrative numbers mostly to demonstrate the trends than other factors, right? And so the graphs show you both at 20 and 30%, Pakistan at 100%, India at 100%. The next one is artillery ratio. Again, you see with the artillery ratio, the situation with artillery numbers is not that as bad as Stark, because it's the only ratio among the 11 that I looked at that was under 1, less than 1, which means that it's sort of favorable to India. But maybe even then, one can debate whether how favorable it is, because what has happened in the Chinese side is that China is moving away, much more than India. China is moving away from classical artillery-based artillery pieces. And one way to see this is when China reorganized its second artillery into the PLA rocket forces. So there's a move towards short-range rockets more than artillery. So maybe even here, it may deceptively look like we are doing well, but issues like quality and replacement that Ambassador Sood somewhat touched on would play a role. And by the way, here the interesting thing to look at is this drop in 2010, and that is exactly around the time when the second artillery was being reorganized into the PLA rocket forces, right? The third graph is that of combat-capable aircrafts. Again, China at 20, Pakistan at 100, and China at 30, and Pakistan at 100. Here, this is, to my mind, this is a very alarming graph, because this is, you see, then as big as and when this number goes larger and larger than 1 over time, the way to interpret this is that the situation gets worse and worse. Because to your 1, the guy has 1.2, 1.3, 1.4, and this is where aircraft, but then this does not surprise us, right? Maybe it's not surprising at all. Those of you who follow defense news would know that there has been a lot of discussion about the depleting strength of the Indian Air Force, and at the same time, a considerable reorganization and consolidation on the Chinese side, right? Pakistan has been more or less steady on this. This one is the two-front ratio for infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers, right? So it's not 1, it's 2 put together, it's a sum. And again, here the trends are looking okay for India, partly because there's a massive push towards mechanization of Indian infantry. So the numbers are good, but the ratios themselves, not the trends, are still not where I think it should be, because in 2016, it stood at a little bit more than 1.4. This graph shows the two-front force ratio for fighter aircrafts plus fighter aircrafts that have ground attack roles, right? These are two distinct kind of aircrafts. And here again, you see that this problem of the Air Force comes in, because the ratio keeps on going higher and higher and higher. And in my paper, I think I called this the most depressing graph of the entire research. Looking at the naval side, naval still good, but remember that when if I'm looking at a two-front force ratio of 0.15, which was the case in 2016, I'm only taking into account 10% of Chinese destroyers. Clearly, if you add all Chinese destroyers, all Pakistan does not have destroyers, so this is actually just literally a China-India force ratio. Then if you take into account all of them, then obviously the situation changes. But then again, China is never going to deploy all of its destroyers, right? Because, I mean, they have a large coastline. They have to worry about Japan. They have to worry about the United States. They have to worry about everybody else, right? So these are for the destroyers. For frigates, again, the numbers are okay. Again, at 10, 20, 30%. Trend is a little worrying, because the numbers seem to be going up. If you look at the report, the numbers are actually cited, which are not in the graph. So you'd have 1 point something. So I encourage you, if you want to dig deeper into this, for the actual ratios. Tactical submarines, which I also counted SSNs, so which are nuclear attack submarines into tactical subs. There, the picture is, again, not very encouraging, right? Because you have, but there has been some progress, I think, which is why the ratio has kind of come down a little bit, even from 2013 to 2016, so maybe not that bad. Naval combat aircraft, the ratios, see, this is where it's a very interesting graph, because when I was gathering the data for this, I couldn't make sense of this dip that happened, and this sudden dip. And what had happened is that the Chinese had a large fleet of very obsolete naval combat aircrafts that they, in one go, they decided to get rid of it. So I went back to the IISS volumes and I was like, okay, am I copying the numbers correctly? But then that's what happens. I think again the numbers are good. One of the reasons why you see India stands somewhat favorably here is because of the acquisition of the aircraft carrier, right? And then you need to equip it with combat aircrafts. I'll just leave you with I want the discussants really want to listen to what the discussants have to say. So just a quick upshot, the results. I think the result is this. The two-front force ratio was never in India's favor to begin with. That is clear from the analysis that I've just presented. But it is currently shifting in favor of the adversary, both for the Indian Army as well as, and much more strikingly, for the Indian Air Force, right? Even after considering very small fractions of the Chinese military involved in a two-front conflict. That was one clear upshot of the numbers, number crunching. The second upshot was the naval picture. And here, when it comes to the time series strengths, it is marginally better than that of the Army and the Air Force, certainly a lot better than that of the Air Force, though the force ratios themselves remain problematic. Because remember, as I said, I'm just taking 10%, 20% of the PLA Navy. Right. I'll just leave it at that. Thank you, and I look forward to discussing this more.
Thank you, Abhijnan. Thank you for.
Good afternoon, everybody. When I was approached to review this paper, I mean, in the sense that to give the comments on this paper, the first thing that struck me was whatever Abhijnan said. It is a simple arithmetic kind of a calculation which tells you that the numbers don't match. If you look at it from that perspective, I think the paper does the justice for whatever it set out for. But again, there are a number of assumptions that have been made which can be questioned, which can keep changing, actually speaking, because when you say China-Pakistan relations with India continue to deteriorate, it is not deteriorating at all points. Sometimes it is improving, sometimes it is going into a little bit of a limbo. So these changes will keep changing, and then we need to fit them into this. The other thing that I wanted to say is, even though he has taken a percentage of numbers to be pitched against India, the issue that comes up is that even those numbers will not be able to fit in when you face the Chinese. The reason is very simple. If you say whatever percentage of tanks you take, 20% of tanks, which comes to about 1,000 plus tanks in the case of.
Not going to fit the terrain.
Sorry?
Probably not going to fit the terrain.
Yeah. So it will not fit at all. So if you just calculate it in this manner and say that this many tanks can come against you, that assumption itself actually is a little misplaced. There are only two places along that entire 4,888 kilometers of border that the tanks can be deployed. So if you just pitch it number to number, again, the number of destroyers you talked about, number-wise, yes, I agree. There are actually, he has got too many of them. But the fact of the matter is, can he sustain them in the Indian Ocean region? And if he can't sustain them in the Indian Ocean region, those numbers are no good to anybody. So these are the things that I thought I'll flag it for this particular thing. Aircraft ratios, etc. are absolutely right. I mean, I got no questions to ask on those ratio purposes. But the issue is, how are they going to be employed is the problem that we need to actually look into. Leveraging integrated theater commands. Now, please look at the Chinese theater commands. The Chinese theater commands are actually geographically divided, and particularly the theater command that is going to look at India. Actually, the theater commander manages 60% of the territory of China, the Western Theater Command. For any commander to orchestrate operations at such a large area is not going to be an easy thing at all. He has to contend with different types of terrain, different types of altitudes, different types of deployments. I mean, it's going to be a nightmare for any commander to orchestrate this. So this is something that we need to, again, keep in mind. The result of the burden of creations of a new mountain divisions to counter the Chinese threat, I'm not sure that is the only reason why this thing has gone flat. There may be many reasons for the defense budget and the defense allocation is varying. That I'm not sure that we can attribute it to only to the mountain divisions and then their being stopped for the time being. So that is not the way probably I will look at it. There may be any number of factors that would have made the defense allocations flat, actually speaking. The Pakistan may indeed find it convenient to launch a limited attack in Kashmir. Please understand the way two-front war will be orchestrated. If that happens, first of all, that shouldn't happen, because that is what Ambassador Sood and others are supposed to ensure, that it doesn't happen in that manner. Ultimately, if it happens, what happens is that the strategy that is going to be followed is going to be different. I would like to discuss it here. We can discuss it sometime later in person. That's a different issue. The issue that comes up is Pakistan may say that I'm going to only launch a limited war in J&K. But the fact of the matter remains, the escalation ladder and the escalation prerogative remains with India in that case. So there are things that have been thought about and worked in various war games regarding this. Okay. The reduction about the PLA Second Artillery Corps and is going in favor of rocket force. Please understand that this concept of PLA rocket force came only in 2015 November, when Xi Jinping announced the reforms. And it didn't change anything at all. Second Artillery Corps is actually the name for the rocket forces of China even earlier than that. So to say that it has shifted from a conventional artillery to only the rocket force kind of a thing may not be the correct assumption to do. Basically, what has happened in this change is the same rocket forces, when earlier named as Second Artillery Corps, now they are being named as PLA Rocket Force. Nothing else has changed as of now, except that in the hierarchy of services, they are now treated on par with Army, Navy, and the Air Force. Neither in the command and control system nor in the other issues, no changes have come up as far as this is concerned. The PLA being a force multiplier for Pakistan military, please take your mind back to all the war that you have fought with Pakistan and the reactions of the Chinese during those wars. If you look at that, there is hardly any indication that it is going to physically intervene. There may be some movements of, say, patrols here and there, some construction of infrastructure that could have taken place. Other than that, either in 71 or in 65, 71, 99, you look at the trend. And if you look at also the Chinese psyche, etc., they're not going to fight somebody else's war. So this is something that you need to understand when you fix this into this. 30% of the PLA Navy, I have already told you. Please understand, these figures are till 2016, okay? Now, if you go to 2018, there is a drastic change in the figures of the Navy. Because in the last 5 years, Chinese PLA Navy has commissioned 84 ships. So if you pitch that into this, the ratio will get skewed. But then again, the point I come back to is the same thing which I mentioned to you earlier, that will he be able to sustain those ships in the Indian Ocean region? That is something that we need to actually look into. Expeditionary role for newer generation of destroyers, I agree with you, because the capabilities that these destroyers have got has got an expeditionary capability. Not only the destroyers, even the frigates for that matter, which have come up now, and the corvettes that he has been commissioning, all of them have got the capability of this. They got stealth capabilities, they got advanced weaponry capabilities, they got sustenance capabilities. So that point I'll agree with you. They are looking towards expeditionary, and to that extent I'll support you with that Defense White Paper of 2015, which gave that enhanced role to the PLA, all the three services. And they're also looking at an increased marine strength of 100,000, which will again indicate expeditionary capability. So as far as the expeditionary capability is concerned, I'm fully with you. That is something that we need to look into. Tactical nuclear weapons. This is another thing. These kind of things should not be loosely used. The reason why I say this is, potential alternative may be a tactical nuclear weapon. But the issue is, please understand, nuclear weapons are only potent till the time the deterrence remains. The moment the first nuclear weapon is used, the deterrence is gone thereafter. And second thing is, you have said this, but then if you look at the counter nuclear doctrine, it doesn't say a fixed quantity of yield to react. So what happens is you use a tactical nuclear weapon and the opponent side start using a massive one, then who is going to be? Because ultimately the blame will come on you for having used a nuclear device. So these issues need to be understood, and tactical nuclear weapons, please understand, they gave up actually between the NATO and the US forces, NATO and the Russian forces. They went in a big way for all these tactical nuclear weapons initially, basically because to face the enhanced that of the Russian armor. the volumes of Russian armor they had to face with. Ultimately, they decided that is going to be counterproductive. And those people have actually put them to rest. So please take these factors into mind when you put this. Maybe that you will find a different kind of an answer to this. What is worrying is India's loud proclamations about having arrived as a global power. I don't know. I don't think we have proclaimed it. We have never proclaimed it as a global power, not yet in any case. And of course, there are a lot of books like Bharat Karnat's book, I'm sure, why India is not a great power as yet. Things like that are there. But I don't think we have declared ourselves a global power, and not are we intending to do it in the near future. With that, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Is the AC has been switched off? Can we ask them to put it on? Okay, thank you. Thank you, General Saab. Let me now turn to Jayadeva and ask him for his comments. Jayadeva?
Thank you. Thank you and good afternoon. Thank you for calling me here today. A lot of what I had to say, I think Abhijnan has already put qualifiers and said that he didn't want to attempt those things. Nevertheless, let me start by touching on the topic itself, on the two-front war. And certainly it was triggered by comments that were made, as you said. Why the comments were made, I think also needs examination, whether they were just off the cuff, whether they were intended to signal a rethinking or whatever it was. But I'm glad that you picked it up and attempted this paper. But let me say that the two-front war as a concept, or even as a thinking, has been in existence in the Chinese mind since at least the 1980s, early 1980s, and it has been reflected in their writings. So if we see their military media as well as their party papers, etc., there have been references to a two-front war. As far as this report is concerned, I think a major limitation is the fact that you have used the IISS reports of 10 years. My preference would have been for your looking at the primary material of the Chinese and of the Pakistanis. I think that would have given a better idea, not only of how they propose to use it, but what their thinking is. And, when you use IISS, etc., there is a danger of a Western bias creeping in. I'm not saying it has, but it's a possibility. And I think that needs to be kept in mind. Again, the years that you have used, 2008 to 2017, I think leaves you just 2 years, of which probably the operative part would be 1 to 1.5 years, of when the Chinese actually began putting in place the required military infrastructure for any potential fusion of military capabilities between China and Pakistan. And that is 2015. They'd started other things earlier, but I think steps on the ground have started after that. There was a reference to tactical nuclear weapons and all. I think that was competently dealt with. Of course, the Chinese and Pakistanis are cooperating there. But when you talked about the possibilities of Pakistan taking advantage of an India-China conflict, you sketched out 3 scenarios. No quarrel with those, that's possible. But I think we need to look closely at the situation that is developing in Kashmir. There is a convergence of interest. In fact, if I may say, a strong convergence of interest between China and Pakistan on Kashmir. And we might even find a new nature of warfare that emerges as they try and sort matters out there to their advantage in Kashmir. The defense capabilities you have given, I think in stark terms, there's no question of challenging those. We are outgunned, out-tanked, and outshipped, as you would say. But here there are a couple of things that one does need to keep in mind. And though you said that you haven't factored them in, but things like battle experience, training, topography, the psychological profiles of the people, I think are extremely important. And one cannot attempt a paper like that unless you take that into account. And let me just mention 2 examples, small examples. One is China's production capacity of military ordnance, warships, etc. It's very well developed. And the fact that they're adding one what they call Aegis class destroyer every 3 months to their naval inventory gives you an idea of how rapidly they're moving ahead. They're working already on the 6th aircraft carrier. So they moved very fast. They're trying to develop new aircraft, etc. And all that is happening. But pertinent here is a remark made by the chairman of the China Shipbuilding Industry Corporation, which is the premier body for naval warships. And he said we are building the most advanced warships and weaponry for the Navy, but I doubt whether our naval officers and personnel have the capability to use them. I mention that only when, because just numbers are not enough. And I think it's worth keeping that in mind. Second, the PLA Air Force, while your charts do mention that the gap is narrowing, again, there are two factors I think that come into play here. One, their training has only been ramped up recently, but their night flying started very late. It was only in 2012 that they actually started night flying. And the first landing on an aircraft carrier by a naval aviation aircraft was just about a few weeks ago or a month ago. So I think that is important. And the second thing is that when they talk of Tibet and the conflict with India, they seem to be very wary about the potency of the Indian Air Force. So a lot of effort is underway. You would have come across the report about 4 new airfields being built in Tibet, and they have made a direct correlation with that construction with India's Air Force and its capability for causing them damage. They are also looking and toying with the idea of using drones and missiles in this place. So I think it's an important factor that we need to keep in mind when we look at this. The other is not nuclear, but how the Chinese plan to fight. I think it's somewhat relevant here. They're not looking for, if I may call it, a contact warfare right in the beginning. They're looking to cyber first. And their attempt would be to cripple us there and then go in with missiles and the Air Force. So the nature of warfare, as I said, could be different from what we are anticipating, and just mere calculation of the number of ships and tanks may not come into play. A major issue here is the nuclear capability of all 3 countries, which you have set aside. I think that's very important. And if you read the Chinese writings again, they set a lot of store about the capacity of a country to use the nuclear weapons. And they seem to have doubts about whether India will really stand up and resist a Chinese effort. I think Chumar and Doklam should have given them other indications, but they still have doubts about when it comes to a showdown, whether we'll be willing to use a nuclear weapon and when our threshold will be reached. So I think I will conclude by just saying that in addition to these points, if the report has to carry, I think, more weight in the target audience that you have in mind, perhaps some recommendations, specific recommendations would have been in order about whether and how the army needs to rethink its organization and its method of warfare, whether they need to look at certain other areas to modernize, and whether the country is harnessing or is not harnessing the resources that it has at its command, private, civil and military, to really further our strategic objectives. So I think if that had been done, it would have been a solid report. But I'm very glad that you've attempted this. I think it's something that is overdue, and hopefully it's the first of many more. Thank you.
For these comments. Now, something that we should have done at the outset, but we were waiting for you, so we wanted a full panel here. So for the record, let me just formally release the report. Thank you. Now that we have heard the discussants and you've seen the presentation by Abhijnan, let me now throw open the floor, and I will request you to please identify yourself and any institutional affiliations that you may have, and then ask a question. Yes.
Hello, my name is Shripati. I've got three questions. Using the same parameters, Abhijnan, that you used, have you analyzed Germany's two world wars? Because they actually fought a two-front war not once but twice. And in the Second World War, the Nazi Germany from day one was preparing for a two-front war. Whereas in First World War, a two-front war happened. Second question, have you, using the same parameters, gone through the arithmetics of all the India-Pakistan wars? And how did that play? And India-China standoffs. Okay, in the case of the India-China standoffs, most of your data sets may not be useful because it was largely an infantry to infantry show of strength. The India-Pakistan border standoff. So if and in that, and taking these three and correlating it to your study, would that have changed the entire perspective of the study?
First thing is, thank you very much for this lovely report. I mean, it's quite eye-opening from some angles. But I would like to bring out the point which has been brought out, that we have to keep in mind, very, very importantly, the indigenization capacity of the country. I mean, having a 1 week war is a different thing. If you remember the brass tack exercise, the army, the capabilities, were shown, and people were criticizing the army chief for having got us to brink of war. But he opened everybody's eyes that we cannot even sustain 1 week's exercise, forget the war. So the logistics, etc., came into play, and that comes to a very important question. Will the national logistics support this? When you are having a two-front war, you will be changing theaters. As it was brought out, the Germany, what had happened, the Eastern Front and the Western Front. There constantly, everything comes to a standstill, no private, the trains move except the military trains. Then the problem arises, can the Indian structure take this punishment? And finally, I'd like to ask you, sir, we have brought out the nuclear question very well, but Chinese, of course, will look at us with contempt, but I do not know how much of contempt they should have, because can we both take the punishment of nuclear war? Because look at Delhi, do we have a single nuclear shelter or a nuclear medicinal device, or are Red Cross or other offices geared up to face the nuclear? I don't think so. In the poorest country of Europe, you have to build a nuclear basement before you get your map approved. So with these questions, things also should be brought into your study. When you write a book, I think you will get into that. Thank you.
The report has firstly, the report is quite exhaustive to some extent, of course. The one aspect which has not been covered, we have been saying a two-front war, but we have also been saying it 2.5 front. That is, that half front is basically for our own, that is the internal strife which is there also. That's not going to go away. That's what we have to have a cater for that also. The other aspect is there. Yes, we have had in fact, after the 62 war, I had a 65 war, 71 war, etc. Both of a time or something else, the Chinese had a chance to have, in fact, with us. They have not done anything. They will not. They could do it, but they didn't do it anything as well. I mean, are we not jumping something like, okay, they are going to have it like this one? Thank you.
The discussants and the questions. I was just noting down all the questions and comments, and I noticed that I have like 3 pages of them, so I'll try and pace myself into this. Regarding General Narasimhan's comment about assumptions, or whether that is foreign policy aspects or geography or theater commands, I completely agree with all of them. In fact, that was both in the paper as well as in the presentation I just made was recognized. But at the same time, I also want to reiterate one point. Force ratios are used in the military. Force ratios are still, so there must be some nugget of wisdom in using force ratios, and this is just an augmented force ratio. More interestingly was the general's questions about nuclear weapons. I know that it's a very touchy subject. It's a very touchy subject. It should not be discussed in polite company, that whether Indian nuclear weapons should have a role in Indian defense policy. I don't mean it as a deterrent, I mean in a warfighting ability. There's extensive Western literature on escalation control, nuclear ladder. Sir, you are aware of Harman Khan's work, and so on and so forth. So one can debate that, but then that becomes a very theological debate. And as Michael Howard once said, discussion around nuclear weapons is like theology in the classical sense, because both can only be verified in the afterlife. Then that's an issue. India as a great power, sir, when this government came to office in 2014, our then Foreign Secretary said India will become a leading power. Leading power, which is I interpret that in polite Indian speak for great power. So that was the stand.
Will become his future.
Will.
He
Country
didn't
of.
say when.
Ah.
Did he put?
No. But we are on the path, or paraphrasing him.
He didn't tell you how long the path is going to be.
I mean, even Xi Jinping is talking about 2049.
Oh, no, but they're very precise. No? And Mr. Ranade's comment, sir, completely agree with you. One of the limitations. One of the issues, sir, that you raise, IISS data has problems. I agree with you. Having said that, I wanted to build a concrete time series from a single source so that the data was consistent across time. In some instances, I had found primary sources for 1 year, but then not for 2 more years, and then erratically again for another year. That would have brought in methodological inconsistencies into picture. But I'm aware that IISS, I think when the part 2 of this paper is written, if and when, I will also try and do this with the CIPRI numbers and see if there are some problems that can be. But again, that's also Western. But they're Swedish, so they're okay. In terms of now the other questions from the audience, Shripati, Germany's World War II experience, very interesting question, but there is no data. At least not that I'm aware of. Very concrete, granular data is not available. Again, across time. So the way to study this would be across the combat area, extension of when the combat was taking place, and detailed data. I'm not aware of it. If you know a source, please let me know.
No, but there is a difference. I must support you on this. There is a difference. Germany initiated the war.
That's right.
And Germany initiated the war and went for a two-front subsequently. Okay. But that is not the case which we are talking about here. We are talking about a scenario in which we are going to face the two-front war. So, please also understand, any country which starts an offensive will have to have the kind of superiorities which Abhijnan is saying. There's no other way you can start an offensive. Ultimately, how it pans out is a different ball game. But in our case, it is the reverse of it. So, I don't know whether the analogy will work out really well in case you pitch that in that case. Indo-Pak conflict, I'm sure you will be able to.
Yeah, Indo-Pak conflict, I think that is more tractable, but this is then just a standard force ratio. In fact, there's a paper by Walter Ludwig III on conventional deterrence in India-Pakistan conflict. MBT ratios were tracked for a very long time, I think a 30-year period. So, but then that can be replicated through IISS numbers. But I'll also tie on something that both the General and Mr. Ranade and some commentators here brought in, is the initiation of this hypothetical two-front war. And to my mind, it can only happen in one way, which is the case that Pakistan takes advantage of a hot conflict between India and China. Because as all of you have pointed out, a lot of you have pointed out, there have been instances in the past all instances in the past when India has gone to war with Pakistan, and China has decided to say, well, we are not going to get involved, as late as the Kargil conflict, which was the latest example of this. But I'm not so sure that the alternative is going to work. I also don't think the probability of a collusive threat is that potent, because China has to fry its own fishes at this point. So to team up with a perceived rogue state, and overtly attacking India. I think that is a little too dramatic. I don't believe in that. I don't think that's a possibility. Wing Commander Bakshi, sir, your remark, indigenization is important, of course. Logistics chains, those have, I mean, in a complete net assessment of a two-front war, a full assessment which factors in geography, which factors in all training, psychological profiles, as Mr. Ranade put in, all of this will have to go in. Nuclear war, can we fight it? Again, theological discussion. But I think one can think of role for Indian nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons in Indian defense policy. Sir, your remark about 2.5 front, that's very tricky because you're mixing these notions, which are essentially notions about combat in an interstate context, with that of intrastate. And analytically, as a scholar, I can't think of a very easy way of writing down some formula and doing this. But I agree with you. If somebody can do this, I mean, it's going to be great. Yeah.
Three and a half million people had evacuated. The Second World War Calcutta. So you can imagine what will happen around. You just don't know. 65, half the Jodhpur evacuated and started running towards Pali. So please, I'm telling you, this is a very serious matter. Yes.
Right, my name is Abhijeet Singh. I'm a senior fellow here, and I just have to say, make one sort of quick remark, which is that while Abhijnan was working on this report, he did talk to a lot of us that have served in the military and try to get our inputs into what we thought about it. And there is a whole context to why Abhijnan has done this. I think it is important that at the time that he was writing this report, there was a lot of talk about India's getting prepared for a two-front thing, we've got to sort of have the capability to. And on the other hand, there were some army officers, senior army officers, that were saying that it's insane to consider that we should go and even be thinking about something like a two-front war. So I'm just going to tell you about a little experience that I had when I was in uniform. Now that I'm not, I can talk freely about it. I was in a think tank, and we were asked by the IDS, which is the integrated headquarters of the integrated defense, to do something like this. And some of us that have been in the military are reflexively opposed to any exercise like this because of the same reasons that the discussants brought out. What parameters, what capabilities, so subjective, you don't know how it's going to be. For example, psychology, so subjective. You can't really write anything on psychology and say, we have a better psychology than Chinese. So we actually prepared a report on why we shouldn't do a report. And we got back to the ideas to say that, look, these are the various reasons why you should not be asking us to do something like this. But we were clear that this sort of an exercise cannot be done. And even if it is done, we might arrive at conclusions that might not actually be borne out by facts on the ground. Now, what the ideas told us is very interesting, which is why I encouraged, I personally and a lot of us also encouraged or began to do an exercise of this sort. What the idea said is, we are not asking you for a net assessment on how you will fight the war. We are just asking you to do something wherein we know what a two-front war looks like. What are we looking at? And I think what Abhijnan's report brings out, I agree. I mean, he's the first person, and I told him sometime back when the report was actually released on Twitter, much earlier than it was released now, there's a lot of criticism that came on Twitter. What about geography? How can you deploy so many tanks? All of that is good. But what Abhijnan's report brings out is that we are woefully unprepared for a two-front situation. If you just look at the numbers per se, it is not right for us even to be looking at talking about a two-front war. What we need to be doing is to be developing the institutions, the capacities, institutional capacities, the training, etc., to be able to prepare ourselves firstly for a one-front war, a 1.5 front war, or a two-front war. So I think from a military perspective, it is interesting that Abhijnan, who's not spent a day in the military, actually attempted something like this. He looked at the sources, and in our case, we told the IDS that, do you want us to look at the primary sources, the Chinese and the Pakistani sources? Well, all of that is false. The Chinese often exaggerate their numbers. In some cases, they underreport their numbers. So I think in some ways it's a good thing that Abhijnan actually looked at neutral numbers and came what he did. I think it's creditable that he did something like this, but I'm not suggesting in any way that this is a sort of a fair representation of what the picture on the ground is. But for us at the ORF, I think this is a really significant work, and my compliments to you, Abhijnan, for having done this. Thank you.
Uh, Sushant Sareen from ORF. One observation on, I don't know how many countries are actually would look forward to the prospect of a two-front war. Frankly, I think it's a bad idea under any circumstance. Uh, but having said that, some of the scenarios, we tend to look at history and say that when India and Pakistan were fighting wars, the Chinese stayed away from it. They might have made a few noises, uh, but I think we ignore the new realities. And the new realities are that the Chinese today are a much bigger power than what they were in those days, number one. Number two, the China Pakistan nexus is far deeper today than what it was in the past. Number three, even if we have a one front war, and for example, we are taking out Gwadar or we are taking out some other part of the fabled Silk Road of China Pakistan Economic Corridor, which we might actually be doing the Pakistanis a favor, but I don't know how the Chinese would like to look at it. So, to imagine that because we are in a one front war, the other side is going to keep quiet, it's a one way kind of a causation. I don't think that's a very realistic assumption in the new realities which are unfolding. That is one. The other part of it is that while we might expect that, if you have some kind of a hot conflict with the Chinese, the Pakistanis would like to do the Chinese a favor and jump into a conflict. That's quite real. But the in any case, I think just thinking about a two-front war, because it's a very real possibility. Uh, I think what you've done in your study is at least show the starkness of the numbers, whether the numbers hold, what the other equations are, what other parameters come in. And I completely agree with you. All of those other things are going to come in. But I think we need to do, as a serious nation, we need to do these kind of number crunching, to do these kind of studies, because there are clearly emerging gaps in our defense preparedness, especially in light of the new strategic scenarios which are unfolding before us. So, frankly, I think you've done a great job. And anybody who calls you a traitor, I think no, no, because you've been labeled one on the joint doctrine, you've been labeled another one on this one. I think the next project is going to label you, permanently affix the stamp of a traitor before you. But I think you've done yeoman service to this thing.
Thank you for the great report, Abhijnan, and a lot of math getting used in it is quite nice to see. So, if one was to take the project forward and write more on this, how would one bring in topography, joint operability, infrastructure, especially in the cases of a two-front war? I believe that high-altitude warfare will play a very big role in one way or the other, be it against China or against Pakistan. And as we know, whoever occupies the higher position in these battlefields has a distinct advantage over the other, as was seen in Kargil. So, if one was to go ahead with such a project, how would one factor in these? Is it mathematically possible to do so, or would just have one have to rely on more qualitative assessments of one? Thank you.
Thank you, Tunir, for giving me an opportunity to plug my next paper, which should come out in the next couple of months. And in fact, this is where I had done, not on a two-front, but at least on India and Pakistan, on a more realistic analysis, which involves these force ratios, but also topography. Training is very hard to measure. I mean, but doctrines, offensive doctrines versus defensive doctrines, that can be done, but psychology and training is difficult. What I did in that paper is not mathematics, right? Because the thing is, this becomes a much larger. I'm not even aware of any formal or mathematical methodology that tackles things like topography into account. Maybe very granular war games can help, but that's a very large task. But I think in general, the one thing that came to me when I was doing the literature search for this entire project was this paper that I mentioned to Shripati in the context of his remark, which was Walter Lardwick's work on conventional deterrence and India-Pakistan relationship. And he, to my mind, is the only person who actually looked at all of these factors in the context of this. The other point is incorporating this issue of the nuclear overhang, right? How do you quantify the effect of a nuclear overhang, because that's a reality. Because that's a reality that compresses the conflict in time and space both. Because as one of the discussants brought in, the onus of escalation would be with us, which means we'll push for both either horizontal escalation or vertical escalation, but then there is going to be a pushback. But it's going to be a limited conflict. I can't imagine a conflict between India and Pakistan going on for months and months and months, right? Because the nuclear overhang comes in. How do you quantify that? I don't know, but stay tuned for the next paper.
I'm Air Marshal Navarre from Center for Air Power Studies. Just a few imponderables, Abhijnan. Firstly, as far as which I think, if you just keep them in mind, you'll go along with your book and keep those. They are not formulae, but there are some aspects which you possibly may like to keep in mind. First is the Chinese propensity for hyping all their achievements. That is, if an aircraft gets airborne at night over the sea, next day it is flashed on CCTV. No, this is actually happening because someone mentioned that 2012 they have just started night flying, but over the sea there seems to be some sort of a fear to fly over the sea, and the Indian Air Force has been, and other air forces in the world have been doing it for ages. So it just talks about their propensity to hype things. Second thing is they have to set aside. You've talked about 10%, 20%, and 30%, but there are certain red lines that they have to keep in mind. Now I'm talking about the red lines are their national capital region, Beijing, and the eastern seaboard. They cannot take any chance with that. So whatever forces are available, they will keep their best. They have the people equivalent of the tactics and air combat development establishment, these so-called top guns. All the top guns, they keep them for the national capital region, for their defense. So the quality of people who will come to the other places is another imponderable which you may like to consider. They will have the strength that maybe the quality of those people who come there, they may not be as good as what you're. Training has already been talked about. Jayadeva has talked about the training, and also as General Narasimhan. Especially of the PLAF, they have made a dedicated attempt to improve their training status, including with Turkey, including with Pakistan Air Force. So they've got some exposure, international exposure. To be fair, they have made a definite beginning, and they're far better. Initially, against Taiwan, they were saying that they don't have air superiority or air dominance over the Taiwan Straits. Today they have, because Taiwan used to jam them electronically, and now they've overcome that. So to that extent, they are developing well. Infrastructure development is a big strength as far as China is concerned. That is what has to be watched, and any development, especially in the Tibetan region, has to be taken carefully and has to be taken note of. And developing capabilities takes time. Once the capabilities have been developed, the intentions can change anytime. So those are the areas that you have to keep in mind. And as you go along your paper and your book, you'll find that things will change significantly. I hope not, but they are likely to. Especially the United States Navy is very, very clear in their mind as far as the Navy is concerned, the PLA Navy. Their ability to be able to actually leverage a blue ocean or field a blue ocean Navy is very, very far in the, it's not in the near future. It's in the far future. Sustaining naval forces in the Indian Ocean region, I think it was touched upon by one of the people who questioned, will they be able to sustain their forces so far away? Is it an overreach from their side? You can develop all the string of pearls and everything, all these ports, but will they be able to sustain them, actually speaking? You may have the best ships, may have the Aegis class destroyers, but what about the reach of the other air forces in the region? And especially when I'm alluding to the Indian Air Force. Okay, will they be able to sustain these, whether it's at Gwadar or it's at Hambantota or it's at any other place, or Maldives, wherever thinking. Okay. And Gagan Shakti 2018, even it was, I would say it was, as far as the number of sorties that was flown by the Indian Air Force, the PLA had to comment, the Chinese had to comment that we never expected the Indian Air Force to be able to do this kind of a number of sorties. We only thought the US was capable of doing this. So there is some respect that you see in this kind of a statement which has come out in the national dailies in China. And when you talk about an inter-theater movement, please remember, as far as Gagan Shakti was concerned, it was only the Indian Air Force aircraft that were used. It was not the total air power of the country. That was never mobilized. Very, very few aircraft were. But when you have the total air power available to you, which means all civil transport, etc., all civil aircraft, that is a capability which you've not factored in. In Gulf War, it was the reservists who flew the entire mission, entire load of flight refueling was done entirely by the reservists as far as the United States Air Force is concerned. So, and the Air National Guard, they flew a lot of missions. Okay, so these are the factors, these are imponderables which you might like to keep in mind. And thank you very much.
I agree with you totally on this, whatever you said. The new realities of PLA, we are watching very closely. At the moment, if you look at the PLA, I don't think I'll have the confidence of getting into a conflict. Not with them. They will be worried about getting into a conflict. Basically, because at the moment when the reforms have been announced and the reforms are being undergone, what has happened is the entire higher defense organization has changed. The organizational structures have changed. The command and control systems have changed. They're actually grappling with it at the moment to see as to how they can stabilize it. It'll take some time. I'm sure they'll emerge better in some future time frame. The second thing is, I also agree that the China-Pakistan nexus is stronger. We have been interacting with many of the Chinese delegation. They very clearly say that our support to Pakistan will remain and it will continue, whichever way it is. The third thing is, how will they react to attacks on CPEC? My reading is, CPEC is a thing that he has established himself. He has given these assets are owned by Pakis. They're not owned by the Chinese. Ultimately, the assets are Pakis. So I am not sure whether they're going to react in case you get into a tip there. So the point I'm trying to make is, when an organization like ORF is wanting to look at a two-front thing and then do these numbers, please grant it to the forces that they would have done it earlier.
I thought Abhijeet said no, they turned it down.
No, that was when he was in uniform, long time back.
After that.
That is one. Second thing is, how to take it forward was a good question. That is basically because what happens is, the moment you start pitching in imponderables into this study becomes much more and more difficult to do. Because those, you can assign, operational research does this, you can assign values to all these factors and then try to work out something. But at best, it will be a subjective kind of an assessment. What he has done here is an objective kind of an assessment. So these two, if you combine it, there is going to be a mismatch at some point in time, but it will be worth the shot to make it. Nuclear overhang was your question. If I were to look at the nuclear overhang and start planning on towards that, what I would look at is the red lines. There is a window below the nuclear overhang for conventional operations. At the initial start itself, I don't think any of the countries are planning to go nuclear. They've got their red lines spelled out. Pakistan spelled it out, Chinese have spelled it out. So the point that you need to understand is, when will you push the threshold? And if you push the threshold, then you should be prepared for some kind of a retaliation on the nuclear front. So under that umbrella, you will still have calculations which you can do to bring out that kind of a result. Thank you.
You want to?
I just want to add to what General Narasimhan said. But firstly, I agree with you entirely that in a paper like this, we need to look at what I would call the new realities. And therefore, I suggested that 2015 is when actually the groundwork began being laid for a potential fusion of military capabilities between China and Pakistan. And I don't think we should look only at the past record. Things have changed. And as far as the CPEC is concerned, it's not just the tangible projects on the ground that matter. Actually, those can be destroyed, it doesn't matter. But it's the Chinese personnel who are deployed there and the stakes that China has. And they're strung all across. So I think it changes the game out there. Second thing was about the nuclear weapons. The Chinese have been assisting the Pakistan, Pakistanis, we know that. And in the development of the tactical nuclear weapons, they've also been helping them to resist US pressure to stop making them. So I think that goes very deep. And here, what I said about the psychological profiling is very important. The Chinese may be deliberate and cautious. About the Pakistanis, I think you'd know better. So just leave it at that.
Of course, against the background of what we've been saying. My name is Ranjit Bhushan. I'm a journalist. Against the background, how does India's defense, the purchase of arms, there's a huge controversy about Rafale now. How does all this square up? Because if you want to improve your arsenal, then how does the two things work out in your view? How do you buy arms?
My question is, in case of conflict with China, how much help do you expect from Indo-Pacific or Quad or something which has been Indo-Pacific?
If you want to go for a war with China, or for that matter, even with Pakistan, you should be prepared to go it on your own. It's as simple as that. Okay. To some extent, some people might come for help, but you can't expect much more. Indo-Pacific actually is a concept. It is not still.
It is on paper, no help is expected from.
On paper, I'm not saying. My opinion is what I'm saying.
I think one of the questions was on essentially reformulating from Ranjit the defense allocation. And I think the question really is, at least from a scholarly point of view, how do you integrate analysis like this done in more depth, frankly, with how much do you want to allocate of your, in terms of your capital expenditure budget? One of the things that I would like to see being done by somebody is a rigorous justification of a 3% allocation of GDP to defense, or a 2.5% allocation, or whatever. The last time, to my mind, the only person who had done this study was in the 70s. Subramaniam Swamy had published an article in EPW. But after that, I've not seen any literature. Perhaps that's a reflection more of the sorry state of defense studies in this country more than anything else. But no, that becomes very important in terms. But the other thing is on, General Narasimhan, you mentioned that the military has done. I'm absolutely sure that this has been done. Unfortunately, if the government released more open source papers,
They don't.
it would have been easier. At least it would have saved me the task of writing a paper. So
But let me tell you, the government to reveal all this is actually a little asking for too much. But this kind of study in an open domain is definitely required, so that people are at least aware of the status and other things that you talked about. To expect a government to reveal all these facts and figures and things like that, I think it is asking for too much. I don't think any country does it.
Rely on double I, double S for defense.
This is Ramananda Sengupta. I'm the foreign editor of the New Indian Express. Abhijnan, in your intro, you have a sentence which says that, should we face a two-front war, some other powers might step in. Would you like to sort of speculate on who those powers might be and what kind of forces we can sort of expect from them? Just a speculation, but maybe a couple of names.
Ramananda, the external intercession that I had in mind was more in terms of diplomatic intercession. Because I agree with General Narasimhan's assessment completely that you cannot expect the United States of America. By the way, that's the country none of us are naming. We're saying Indo-Pacific, we're saying this, that. The question is, will America come to our rescue? No, they're not. Okay, so they're not going to come to our rescue. What they will do is what they did in Kargil. They'll try and put diplomatic pressure. They'll try to reduce the possibility of an overt nuclear or conflict that could go nuclear. But yeah, so diplomatic help, maybe diplomatic coercion, I would say, is what happened during Kargil, that Clinton targeted to Nawaz Sharif. But no, they're not going to come and fight our wars, I don't think.
Closing comments, maybe Jayadeva, why don't you kick off?
Relevant to the paper, one of them. One is when we talk of two-front war and this talk has gone on, tangentially what I also find is there was criticism of the person who made that comment initially, the army chief. And I only think that what other comment could he have made? I mean, it's a kind of comment that you expect from a military leader when when situation is not good. And this, I would prefer that as a tax-paying citizen than someone who talks peace, frankly. And there is an instance that I have in mind about at a meeting where discussions were going on about negotiations with the Chinese, and the political appointee was asking what the bottom line was, in negotiations. And the then chief was saying, well, we can live with this and we can live with that. Till I interjected and asked him, then what's the point of having the discussion if we're going to give everything away? So I think that is one thing we do need to keep in mind, that when we talk about two-front or two-and-a-half-front, when a military leader talks about it, there is a reference to context which we should not miss. The second is, I think, the China-Pakistan situation, in my view, is really not helpful at all. It's something that is becoming more ominous, I would use the term, as the days go by. And that is something we have to factor in. So whether you call it a two-front war, whether you call it a one contiguous border, whatever it is, I think it has the potential of becoming real at some point in time. And the only way out of that is either we develop our asymmetric capability, and you're all very intelligent people here, so you know what that means, or we develop our own indigenous production capacity, which is going to take a bit of time. But I think that is what we need to look at. And as Abhijnan said, someone needs to do a study. If we can jack up our defense budget to 3% or 3.5, maybe that will be the way.
Again, I'll also just summarize just 2 points. One is on the infrastructure development, that point came up, and the sustenance of the PLA in the Indian Ocean region. We are looking at this point in time, what we are saying is that they will not be able to maintain it. Say, if you look at, say, 10 years ahead and see where all they are going to position themselves, it might give you a different picture. So we need to constantly be looking at the next step that the Chinese would do. Where are they going next? And then see how these things fit into the kind of things that we are planning. The second thing is on the 3% defense budget. I'm not very sure that we'll reach somewhere around 3% at any point in time in the near future. But what I would probably look at is how can even this defense budget that has been allocated can be efficiently utilized. Year after year, we hear that so many thousands of crores have been surrendered. It has gone back to the finance ministry. Can we in some way work out a methodology by which we will be able to consume the entire defense budget that has been allocated to us? I think that will be a better study to do than to go for 3%, because 3% is a very politically motivated and a politically sensitive kind of an argument. But I think inward looking may be a better option to do that. Thank you.
Mr. Ranade brought out It's a very interesting thing that as a tax-paying citizen, sir, you would have expected General Raut to say exactly what he said. What confuses me a little bit was Air Marshal Dhanwa's statement, Vice Marshal, who had said in 2016. Chief Marshal, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Yeah, so that traitor label will now come, definitely. At least from this, apologies, sir. And I just want to read out his statement, because I quoted his statement in the paper, where he said, look, we're not ready to fight a two-front war. What worries me, and this is where, it goes back to the work I did earlier this year on jointness in the Indian system. Because when two of my chiefs do not agree on an assessment, sir, that concerns me as a tax-paying citizen. Um, the final point, and I will make this controversial point and then run away, which is one way to do defense allocations within 1.6 or 2% is a move to tactical nuclear weapons. I've done some preliminary calculation. A warhead is very cheap. A 20 kiloton warhead, in some calculations that I'll publish very soon, in my rough estimate, it comes to about 2.5 to 3 million US dollars. That's much cheaper than a T-72 tank, sir, by $1 million. So if we can get command and control ready, all the things that India does not want to do, maybe I'll still pitch the tacticals. Thank you.
This paper need not have been written. Abhijnan could have just said, this is what the army chief says, this is what the air chief says, and therefore, clearly, we are not ready for a two-front war. Or unless we are ready for one service is ready for a two-front war and one service is not. And we could have closed the chapter. I tend to agree. I'm not too convinced about the 3%. This is like Trump saying, oh, you must reach, trying to push his NATO allies to cross 2% or some such thing. I think we know that there are problems of utilization. We also know that within the defense budget, what is the largest chunk? We have other challenges in terms of basically military reforms, in terms of moving to a more, building a military force which is more capable of handling today's threats, and which are obviously by their very nature going to be very different. We've all seen different technological developments that are taking place, not just in the nuclear field. We are talking of aerospace, we're talking of robotics, we're talking of artificial intelligence, whole host of things like that, which will change the nature of the battlefield. And so this is a very classical two-front war, kind of a scenario. But actually, I think in today's reality, a two-front war or even a one-front war could look pretty different from what this is. But I can see that this is an issue which has obviously energized everybody to brave the rain and come here. So, Abhijnan, thank you very much. Thank you, General Narasimhan. Thank you, Jayadeva.